All right, hi, this is Danielle Mundele, and I'm with the OpenStack UX team. And today I'll be presenting the results of the usability evaluations we did for Horizon Searchlight. So Searchlight is a plugin for Horizon, which provides a consistent search using the API across OpenStack resources. It allows full text search, and it offers dynamic facets to filter specific types of resources. An overview of the findings was that Searchlight generally was, very well received. It was seen as an improvement over the current search, which is implemented in Horizon. And one of the things that participants really liked was the ability to do a full text search. Before, they were required to choose a filter, and here it allows the option for that. And in getting familiar with the tool, pretty much everyone felt comfortable after a few minutes of using it, about 10-15 minutes of use, or after a couple of tasks in the study. People felt like they had a good handle on how it worked. And there was one thing that came up, though, is that people really wanted to stick to keyboard input and not have to worry about clicking with the mouse to either initiate a search or submit their search. And also people said that they sometimes weren't sure what they should start with, either a full text search or using the filters, because a lot of times they might search for something and then have to start over to sort of follow the flow that Searchlight has to be able to find the resources that they're looking for. But all in all, really wasn't anything that was, requiring an overhaul. There's just a couple of recommendations that we'll talk about near the end of the presentation that would really improve Searchlight before it's formally rolled out. A little bit about the study design. So we A little about the study design. The goal of this research was to both validate the usability of Searchlight and also determine whether it was an improvement over the current Horizon search. We performed the research through a series of one-on-one usability evaluations where participants had a series of tasks which they completed in a demo version with Searchlight. And at first they had a minute or two to get accustomed to the tool, familiarize themselves. And we also talked about their experience after the tasks to kind of get their general opinion. We talked to 5 cloud operators, and they were all managing a production cloud and were familiar with Horizon. They didn't use it too frequently, but it wasn't new for anyone. And there was only one participant who had a little bit more background knowledge about Searchlight, having watched a summit presentation demonstrating Searchlight's use before taking part in the session. So this was the loose flow that the evaluation took. We started with understanding some background information about the participants, what version of OpenStack they were using, and whether or not they were familiar with Elasticsearch, which is what Searchlight is based on. Like I said before, gave a couple of minutes just to familiarize and make them a little bit more comfortable about the session process. And then we went on to the tasks, doing some more simple tasks first, just sort of exploring basic use of filters, and moving on then to more complex tasks, which required a little bit more domain knowledge or a couple of steps to complete. And at the end, we kind of debriefed with people, asked what their opinions were, and what they liked, didn't like, and if they had any suggestions for improvements. The persona that best fit the profile of people that we spoke with was Ray, who's a cloud operator. And I have the definition here. You can read more about the OpenStack personas at the link at the bottom. And this shows the tasks that we asked operators during the evaluations. So we see that these are ranging from finding specific resources with a certain name or a certain size, looking overall across all resources, how many instances are in a certain state, and onto more complex tasks that maybe require more knowledge to understand the approach of how to find the search result there. The next section talks a little bit more in depth about the main findings that surfaced in talking with participants. So with the search filters, it was really one of the main benefits in Searchlight compared to the previous way of searching in Horizon. And they found that they had a greater flexibility in how they were able to search. However, they did need a couple of practice searches to get fully accustomed to how it worked. For one example, there was a couple of people that seemed very surprised that the filters just popped up right when they clicked on what looks to be a regular search field. And in fact, we observed one person that didn't even see the filters the first time they used them. So another thing that was also kind of a surprise was that they didn't just have one set of filters, but a second set of sub-filters appeared after filtering for an initial category. Another thing was that some people didn't expect to be able to do a regular full text search. They felt that the filters, based on their previous experience in Horizon, was the only way to perform the search, and that they were required to make a selection from the menu before continuing on with the search. So you can see in this image, once that first search box is clicked, you get a menu with 4 types of filters which you could use. Also, regarding the search was sort of how the mechanics of the search actually went, more about the syntax and how people actually performed their search. So we observed a lot of participants have a sort of trial and error approach to understand how that the search was returning their results. And typically there was maybe 2 or 3 searches that a participant would do, and then often they mentioned looking for some help. Maybe there was some examples of searches or certain syntax that was to be used. And that was available to them on the screen, but wasn't really noticeable when they were first looking for it. And also, there was a lot of people who said that they used the command line interface a lot, and they were kind of slowed down by needing to move their hand off the mouse, or sorry, off the keyboard to the mouse to be able to click to submit the search, and wanted to, maybe type out some filter names instead of clicking them from the menu with the mouse. In the next section, we'll take a task-by-task look, and we'll also look at some of the ratings that participants gave each task in regards to how easy they felt the task was to complete. So overall, the tasks were generally easy for people to complete. There was a difference in ratings that was understandably seen as complexity of the search increased. So for some of the tasks that required more domain knowledge, were rated a little bit more difficult than others that were more simple. So for example, the task that had the highest average rating across participants was finding a particular image and launching it. So people really said that they liked the predictive search. They didn't have to fully type out the full name of the resource they were looking for, and that the launch button was very easy to find. Contrasting that, the lowest average rating was for the most complex task of finding a port attached to a certain instance. And this task required 2 steps, which wasn't immediately apparent to participants. And although there was a variation in the amount of domain knowledge that the participants had, sometimes they knew that they needed extra information but weren't sure where to look for it. So it was kind of hard to scan to find that piece of information they needed to move on to the second part of the task. This slide shows a comparison of all the average ratings for the tasks. So you can see task 1 was rated the highest, had all participants giving that the highest possible rating of a 7. And the lowest average rating there for task 6. And it's important to note that only 3 participants got to experience this task due to timing for some of the other participants. So that rating is only has considered 3 of those ratings instead of the 5 for all the other ones. But as you can see, most of these are above what would be considered the mid-range of 4, with some of them varying in ease rating. So the first task was to find and launch an image. And like I mentioned before, everyone was able to complete this task and everyone rated it very high. That said, there were a couple different methods that participants used to complete the task. Some people did a full text search for the name of the image. In this case, it was demo_1. And other people used the filters, first filtering for a type instance, and then looking for the name. And as the image here shows, demo1 is seen there in the blue circle. Also had an interesting quote that sometimes, a participant said if it's a small tenant, they might just, filter for images and find it in whatever list showed up. But if it was larger, they might want to winnow further and type the actual name. And in completing this task to find the launch button was very easy, and it was seen as a good feature to have, very useful, as that launching an image is a pretty common task to do. For the second task, participants found images with a specific RAM requirement. In this case, they were looking for images with at least 2048 RAM. So most people felt this task was easy, but a couple people had trouble getting used to how the search worked for this task. So most of the participants used the filters, and many of them found the minimum RAM subfilter and then searched for the string 2048. And this returned images that had at least 2048 RAM required for them. And there was also a variation. Some people were adding a greater than symbol to make sure that there was 2048 and up for the RAM, so a little bit of variation there. And other people did a full text search. They simply searched for 2048 and then checked back to the type of resource to make sure that they found an image, and then looked for them on a more manual basis. And these people, when they tried to then further filter, they thought that it would be really nice to be able to filter their current list instead of having to go back and then specify the type image as the progression of the filters showed them. The third task was to find resources that were associated with an IP address. So this task looked at finding multiple different types of resources instead of a particular category. So most of the participants did a full text search and realized that they needed to do full text, because if they filtered down to a certain type of resource, they might be doing multiple searches and to be able to find all of those associated resources. And so some people did start with the filters initially, which may have been based on their learned behavior of always using a filter in Horizon. But once they looked at the results, they quickly learned to try the full text search. And one of the biggest barriers to completing this task quickly was the ability to find the field that matched the search that the participants did. They wanted to make sure that the actual IP address that they put in was coming up in the correct area. And to assist with this, there is a column that is shown in the results, and it's called field matches. Here it's circled in blue in the image, but many participants didn't even see this category because they were very focused on the information that came down from that drawer with an information panel. So you can see some of the metadata there. And that's what they were focused on, looking for their IP address to appear there instead of looking up to get a hint at where to look in the columns above. The next task was to find instances that were in a certain state, in this case, looking for instances that were paused. So what this did is took participants through a series of sub-filters that got more and more specific. And when they reached the last set of filters, they were able to see the number of instances in the various states. And we didn't have a screenshot for this particular task, but as you can see here circled, you can tell that there are a certain number of resources that fit each category. And participants really liked having that information before they committed their search because they were able to sort of verify that the results were as they expected. And most people here were successful and rated this very high. This was the second highest average rating with a 6.6 out of possible 7. And most people did feel that these filters were intuitive. And a few people said that they really liked to see the predictive nature of the search in that it showed them results that they could anticipate before they completed their search, which saved on time. The next task was to find resources that matched multiple terms. So exploring the compound search function of Searchlight through this task. Here, participants found all resources associated with both web and Python terms. So here we saw a great variation of ways to go about completing this task. There were some participants that simply put a space between the terms to see how the search would naturally treat it. So whether it was treated as an and or as an or in Boolean logic, if they just provided a space between them. And other people use special characters such as asterisks and plus signs to be able to get at more specifically terms that had both of them instead of just one or the other. And as I mentioned before, there was a lot of trial and error through these tasks. And this was another task that people did try several different searches to see what would show up. So after a couple of trials, a few people mentioned that they wanted to see syntax search and to get an example of how they might format their search to best get results. And as was mentioned before, it was kind of hard to see. So you can see in the image on this slide, it's a very small icon after a string of introductory text, and all the participants said that they skipped over that and didn't read it. So it wasn't really something that they had seen prior to starting to look for it. And when they were actually looking for the terms that they had searched for, again, it took them a while to be able to scan everything to be able to find those target words, web and Python. So some people suggested to have them highlighted, which would draw their attention to those terms a little bit easier. The last task that participants completed was to find ports attached to an instance, which we gave them. So to complete this task successfully, participants needed to first find the instance and look in the metadata to find the attached device ID, which would be common with the port that it would be associated with. So, like I mentioned before, there were 3 people who actually completed this task. And of those 3, pretty much everyone had difficulty completing this task, both in terms of understanding that it took 2 steps and as well as finding the information they needed to move on in the search. So regardless of the amount of domain knowledge the participants had, they had problems looking through the information to know what they needed to find. And they discovered that there were 2 levels of detail information, the first being in the arrow drawer that we saw before, which provides some of the most common metadata. And there was also an additional place to look for information by clicking on the resource name, which would provide even greater detail. So we observed participants taking a long time to look through thoroughly in that information drawer to see if what they needed was there. And only when they exhausted that panel did they look in the extra details, which they said kind of slowed them down a bit from finding what they needed. So, changing the way that this information is displayed to help participants to find things quicker is going to help them, especially for tasks that take multiple steps to get the information they're looking for. And because of that 2-step process, there were a few participants that said that it would be very helpful if that it was maybe only taken care of by 1 step. So tying together information coming from both the nova and neutron sides so that they would have both those information in the same search instead of searching separately from those. And the last section I have here describes some potential solutions. So have some recommendations for some minor changes to Searchlight to improve its usability. The first is to always have participants remain inside the search area of Horizon while using this feature. There were a few participants that noticed once they got deeper into the detail for a certain resource that they were taken out to that resource type. For example, if they were looking at an image and they clicked on the image name to find out more information about it, they were away from the search area and then in the instance panel. And while the backspace key did work, people really wanted to make sure that they stayed within the search so that they didn't lose their place. Another improvement would be include highlighting to make the search terms and the target information that people are looking for easier to find, especially in cases where it's hidden and would take a while to look through all the information that's presented. So participants just wanted a better transparency on why their search result came up with the certain hits, and also look to make sure that the search term that they submitted was somewhere within the resources that were returned. Also, communicating the possibility of full text search is important because this is one of the better features that participants thought was included for Searchlight. So, as I mentioned before, a lot of people were driven by the filters because that's what they had learned from previous versions. So making sure it's clear that they know that full text search is a possibility for this search will help them do a greater variety of searches than were previously possible. And one way that this could be implemented would be changing the text in that search field. Right now it says click for filters, but perhaps it could be expanded to also mention a full text search. Increasing the visibility of finding the search syntax help would help participants and other users find examples of syntax to help them understand how the search function works and reduce the time that they may need to do trial and error to understand the search process. And finally, since most operators are coming from an experience where they're using the command line interface, having the keyboard inputs was definitely going to help them and streamline their process. So enabling them to tab between fields and to submit searches using Enter key is going to reduce the time that they're going to take moving back and forth from the mouse to the keyboard. And that wraps up the presentation today. On the slide, I've included some extra links, resources here to learn more about the Searchlight plugin. There's the wiki page there, as well as a demonstration that was presented at the Austin Summit. Thanks for your time, and I hope you found this informational. And the Searchlight team has definitely been open to hearing some of the feedback from the study, and we'll be implementing a few of the things that we heard in the research into the Searchlight.